I'll leave my phone with you just in case it's... Good morning and welcome to Hudson Institute's Betsy and Walter Stern Conference Center. I'm Ken Weinstein, President and CEO of Hudson Institute. Delighted to welcome you to today's event on protecting American interests in fragile states. In 2002, President George W. Bush's first national security strategy declared on its very first page that America is now threatened less by conquering states than we are by failing ones. Indeed, since then, we've seen the suffering of fragile states that can have a global impact through terrorism, conflicts, pandemics, refugee flows, energy supply disruptions, can all spill across borders and cause greater instability in the global order. And despite the focus on this kind of on fragile states, fragility appears to be spreading. In 2006, the Fragile State Index issued an alert of warning of state failure for 106 countries. Today, 119 countries fall into those two categories. Any U.S. efforts henceforth to stabilize fragile states have met with, at best, mixed results, leading to questions about the effectiveness of our approach and the wisdom of our investments. Meanwhile, the security landscape has changed. 15 years after the Bush administration focused on the challenge of state fragility, the Trump administration's national defense strategy stood this assessment on its head, arguing that, quote, interstate strategic competition, not terrorism, is now the primary concern in U.S. national security. It is in this context that the State Department's Office of Foreign Assistance Resources has undertaken the Strategic Prevention Project, an assessment of whether the United States, whether U.S. assistance has, and more importantly, whether it can address some of the threats to American interests that originate from fragile states. To share with us the findings of the Strategic Prevention Project and the new report just released, I'm delighted to introduce the Director of the Office of Foreign Assistance Resources, Jim Richardson. After we hear from Director Richardson, and we'll have a bit of a dialogue and take questions from the audience, we'll have a panel of distinguished experts moderated by Hudson Fellow Blaise Mistal to analyze the findings of the report and discuss implications of Director Richardson's remarks. Jim came to the State Department after leading the USAID's historic reorganization to reshape the agency, serving as coordinator of the USAID transformation team focused around the principle of ending the need for foreign assistance. At State, he coordinates the allocation of more than $35 billion in foreign assistance. Prior to joining the Trump administration, he served as chief of staff to a congressman from Kansas, good friend to Hudson Institute, Mike Pompeo, who's now gone on, I think we all know, to bigger things. And a great friend of Hudson Institute. We'll be honoring him at our annual dinner on October 30th in New York City. And prior to serving as chief of staff to Congressman Pompeo, Director Richardson was a staffer on the House Defense Appropriations Committee, the House Armed Services Committee, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So delighted to welcome him, looking forward to his remarks and to the conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Director Jim Richardson to the podium.
Thanks, Ken. I appreciate that. Whenever I get introduced like that, I always start to wonder who is that guy. But yeah, the congressman from Kansas has certainly gone on to bigger things. I'm not sure better always. It was a pretty great gig. Pretty great gig we had in Congress. First of all, I just want to say thank you for letting me be here today. I first got associated with Hudson with actually Mike Pompeo. We came over and Mike always, when he first started anything, he always said, you know, let's go meet the smartest people in the room or in this space and really get to know, learn from them. And so we did a tour of various think tanks, and obviously that led us to Hudson. And it really struck home to both of us the importance of this institution and the great policy and new ways of thinking about policy that the Hudson Institute embodies. So, as you just heard, I'm actually the director of the Office of U.S. Foreign Assistance Resources, which is a really long title. So, of course, this being the State Department, we've created acronyms for everything. And actually, a decade ago, when my office was first created, someone said, well, this position should be called F, which is really about as bad of an acronym as you can get. So when I first started a couple months ago, I've only been in this job for about 2.5 months, someone asked me what I did at the State Department, and I said, well, I'm actually F. And they said, oh, no, what's wrong? And I said, no, I'm not F'd, I'm F. It's very different, although sometimes it feels related. But all abbreviations aside, at the core of what I do is I work on behalf of the Secretary of State to promote a strategic, coordinated, and effective U.S. foreign assistance. That means I'm accountable for about $35 billion a year, mostly at the State Department and USAID, that Secretary Mike Pompeo uses to support the administration's policies, while also making sure that those resources are effective in moving those policies forward. Now, if you're like my grandmother, you may have a negative reaction to the term foreign assistance, but as I frequently tell her and my staff as well, foreign assistance is just a tool. In and of itself, it's neither good nor bad. It's just one approach that we use in concert with others, such as diplomacy, to advance specific strategies or policy objectives. So strategically thinking about how we use the tool, when we use the tool, where we use it, that's going to determine if foreign assistance is good or not. But even if foreign assistance is tied to a policy objective, it is also not inherently effective. We need to understand on an ongoing basis whether this assistance is actually doing what we need it to do, simple performance data. This information not only ensures that we are making progress against our objectives, but eventually helps us tell a better story to both my grandmother and other grandparents in America about the impact of our work and effectiveness of assistance. Essentially, that's my role at the State Department. So when thinking about foreign assistance, it's really important to acknowledge that over the past 20 years or so, the world has radically changed. We have seen the rise and impact of new challenges, new donors, and new technologies, all of which has had a serious impact on the effectiveness of U.S. foreign assistance. This is seen most acutely when it comes to fragile states, which I'm broadly defining as countries at the risk of conflict, that are in conflict, or coming out of conflict. The number of countries experiencing high levels of fragility and conflict have grown significantly in recent years, as Ken rightfully pointed out. In 2016, 37 countries were experiencing armed conflict, more than any time in the last 30 years. And then Ken made the reference to the growing fragility, which surrounds that. The United States and the rest of the donor community are desperate trying to find better ways to address fragile states and work in conflict-affected areas. The days of doing development in stable and safe countries are radically fleeting. Roughly half of all U.S. foreign assistance today goes to fragile states. At USAID, the figure is 70%. Globally, over $70 billion of all official development assistance is being spent in fragile states. And nearly all donors across the world are doubling down in these spaces for one simple reason. Weak and poorly governed states give rise to a host of challenges not found in countries at the same level of development. Conflict, terrorism, crime, humanitarian crises, and pandemics. These challenges spill across borders. They demand even greater attention and resources, and they ultimately threaten regional or even global peace and security. So with limited resources, these challenges are crowding out more traditional and sustainable development, making the task of building more self-reliant partners more difficult for the United States and our fellow donors. This challenge actually becomes a lot more complicated when you factor in that we live in an era of great power competition with the rise of malign donors. Many fragile states are increasingly facing political and economic pressures to partner with these new actors for short-term gains that cause long-term challenges. For instance, China. China is taking advantage of these pressures and these countries' vulnerabilities, providing loans in exchange for strategic access to economic resources and infrastructure. In doing so, China is fueling unsustainable debt, unfettered mercantilism, and enabling backsliding in the respect of rule of law, all while promoting its model of political censorship and surveillance. Bottom line, fragile states are both incredibly important and incredibly challenging. It is essential for us to review our business models and ensure that we are matching the challenge by making our assistance more coordinated, more targeted, and more strategic. With all the tools to foster better coordination, from Chief of Mission Authority to the National Security Council, coordination of the United States government in this area might seem to be a given, but I assure you it's not. And when you deal with money, which is at the heart of foreign assistance, fragmentation is always a problem. Just like in physics, entropy is real in the federal government. Unless you are intentional about linking the 22 different federal agencies responsible for foreign assistance, all of whom secretly or not so secretly do not want to be coordinated, each organization will continue to drift apart from each other. This unfortunately has happened with our efforts to respond to fragile and conflict-affected states. But we are making real and concrete progress to fix these coordination challenges. Take our humanitarian assistance response, for example. Fragility and conflict have given rise to an historic level of displacement and humanitarian challenges. Today, there is nearly 71 million people forcibly displaced around the world. This is the highest in recorded history. The international community is mobilizing a response, and the U.S. is right there along with them, where we grew over the past 5 years 41% increased level of humanitarian assistance. Unfortunately, our humanitarian structures were built decades ago, when natural disasters, meaning droughts, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, were the main drivers of humanitarian needs. Today, the response to man-made crises far outpace those to natural disasters, and our system has been slow to adapt. Our humanitarian work has historically been bifurcated between state and USAID, with state focused on refugees and USAID focused on internally displaced peoples, or IDPs. This breakdown made sense as refugees were seen often fleeing war and long-term challenges, where IDPs were fleeing natural disasters that fit more into USAID's comparative advantage. However, with the rise of complex crises around the world, the distinction between refugees and IDPs is fading, and the need for greater coordination is paramount. So today, state and USAID are in the same region, responding to the same challenges with slightly different but related populations. In response, the administration has made it a top priority to ensure state and USAID are working together to address these challenges. We're focused on ensuring co-budgeting, co-planning, and seamless implementation across refugee and IDP populations. These process reforms will create immediate efficiencies in the system, ensure we have limited gaps or duplication, and that while we maintain our moral leadership around the world focused on fixing the underlying challenge. Another key aspect of renewed focus on better coordination can be seen through the U.S. government's response to address the conditions that fuel the crises in the first place. So many of the current crises we see are caused by violent conflicts and instability. Durable solutions depend upon addressing these causes. For this reason, the State Department, USAID, and the Department of Defense have made a renewed commitment to work on stabilization, starting with a common definition. We now collectively define stabilization as a political endeavor involving an integrated civilian-military process to create conditions where locally legitimate authorities can peacefully manage conflict and prevent a resurgence of conflict. Starting in 2017, the three agencies actually came together to maximize the effectiveness of our effort and to stabilize conflict-affected areas. The Stabilization Assistance Review, or the SAR, studied lessons from past mistakes and outlined principles for effective stabilization in clear roles and responsibilities for each organization. The final SAR report outlined a new framework for more carefully targeting and sequencing U.S. foreign assistance in these environments based upon our collective interest, rigorous analysis, and partner burden sharing. At Secretary Pompeo's direction, we are now implementing the SARS recommendations. U.S. country teams are completing interagency stabilization plans to 11 priority countries ranging from Afghanistan and Libya to Mali and Somalia. We will continue to update and institutionalize these plans. We are also revalidating the U.S. interest in rescoping achievable goals in these environments. We cannot ignore our adversaries and competitors as we seek to gain advantages in fragile states. For example, China and Russia and Iran are using instability in key parts of the Middle East and Africa to build patronage networks, access resource, and gain long-term influence. Moving forward, we'll use these new interagency plans to better align resources to the clearly defined political goals and stabilization objectives. So in addition to working better together, the United States government must embrace and resource better solutions. And this is where the Strategic Prevention Project comes into play. My organization is keenly focused on how the United States can better assist fragile states to become more secure, more resilient, and less at risk of violent conflict and threats to their stability. We call this strategic prevention. A recent analysis shows that greater investments in conflict and violent prevention can provide significant cost savings. In fact, one analysis suggests $1 invested in prevention will provide $16 in cost savings over time. And a recent study at the University of Pittsburgh found that for every $10 million spent on certain USAID democracy programs, increased that country's electoral democracy index by 1/3 of a point. This is 2.5 times greater than if the assistance had not been provided. Over the past year, my office completed this strategic prevention project and assessment of how foreign assistance resources can better support strategic prevention in fragile states. This report was released publicly in July. The project rightfully found that more money does not equal more stability. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, foreign assistance is just a tool. Depending on how, why, and when it is used, it can be effective and good, or it can be the opposite. So what matters is how the assistance is structured, delivered, and monitored. The project identified 3 key areas where foreign assistance can reinforce strategic prevention, all of which is connected to the work of DRG, or Democracy, Rights, and Governance. This makes sense, as DRG is often seen as the cornerstone of all sustainable development. First, research shows that societies are much higher risk for violent conflict and instability if they have groups that are excluded from political processes or lack access to justice. These same factors also make them susceptible to external political subversion. Foreign assistance can promote more inclusive political systems and increase social cohesion. Second, government checks and balances and the rule of law are essential for a country's stability. Foreign assistance can strengthen the resilience of fragile state institutions from political and economic shocks. This includes threats from the external actors. Third, foreign assistance can strengthen groups and that can help build and support rule of law in their society. This includes elements of the private sector, and also women and youth leaders. As a side note, the administration is working to implement the Women, Peace, and Security Strategy, as well as the Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative, which is known as WGDP, which for acronyms from a guy who has a terrible acronym, that's a pretty good one. And when the Strategic Prevention Project identified specific examples of assistance making a difference in each of these 3 areas, overall it found most of our assistance to fragile states was not appropriately focused on these areas. So building on this project, my office will insist that we incorporate strategic prevention into our assistance planning for fragile states, while also setting up better conversations with Capitol Hill, as most of foreign assistance is heavily earmarked. We will begin to incorporate analysis of instability, risks, and resilience into our assistance decision-making. We'll also work to provide teams in the field with better tools for designing and implementing conflict-sensitive programs. So I've talked about the first 2, better coordination and better solutions. The third is probably the most critical. Again, I'll say it one more time. Foreign assistance is just a tool. Even if we are strategic and aligned, it can never solve all the world's challenges. We cannot and should not try to do this alone. Ultimately, it is the national and local leaders themselves, not the United States government, who are both accountable and responsible for determining the future of their own countries. We believe that the best development is locally led. We do not want countries to be dependent on foreign aid forever, and most countries do not want to be dependent upon others. The United States should play a supportive role, but it cannot want success more than the host countries if true stability and prosperity is to occur. We seek to promote strong, self-reliant nations that can become enduring economic and security partners with the host countries themselves leading their own development. This is part of this model that we have that is very different than the Chinese model of assistance. In this regard, I'm really proud of the work USAID has been doing under the Administrator Mark Green's leadership with the Journey to Self-Reliance. USAID has reoriented its approach to better support governments in their developments, to develop the capacity and commitment for enterprise-led, enterprise-driven, and sustainable development. This includes a greater focus on mobilizing public and private revenue streams and strengthening local capacity. This is the kind of approach we ultimately seek in our assistance to fragile states. As we pursue these objectives, we are also aware of the need for partnerships among the traditional donor community. This means working closer with the Australians and the Japanese and our European allies, among many others, on aligning efforts and collaborating whenever possible. Burden sharing is a pivotal aspect of our approach. It's not just a buzzword for us. It's critical to leverage partnership and produce results. Working together is always easier than working alone. The United States is looking to seek mutually beneficial partnerships that ultimately share burden fairly, and we must hold our international local partners to high standards. So I have no illusion that any of the work that I'm going to talk about, that I talked about today, and that the panel is going to identify here in a minute, will be easy or straightforward. We face some really complex challenges in fragile states and conflict-affected areas today. Our policymakers and our national strategists face tough policy choices amongst evolving context. As they make these choices, our job is to ensure that our foreign assistance is responsive, agile, and adaptive. We must continue to assess and scale what is working, identify what is not, and continuously refine and target our approaches. And most importantly, we must remain resolutely focused on advancing America's interest and national security. I look forward to working with all of you as we continue to grapple with these challenges. We need your support, your ideas, and your partnership as we deliver strategic, coordinated, effective assistance on behalf of the American people. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I look forward to a good panel.
Thank you, Director Richardson. Hope that it's a pleasure, of course, to have you back here at Hudson Institute. And you not only worked for one really great friend of Hudson Institute, but you also worked for another one, Mark Green.
Yeah,
who,
absolutely.
Was a close partner of Hudson, both in his time in Congress and in his time at the International Republican Institute. So let me first begin by saying I hope you're able to convince your grandmother that you're not effed in your new job and that your new agency isn't effed. Okay, good. Happy to go talk to her if need be. We're happy to send Blaze to talk to her as well.
Of course.
Bring in the real heavyweight. But let me first ask you a question about, so you obviously, we're both at AID and now are at State, and you've been critical to the transformation of AID. And how do you see the relationship between the two evolving on the development side?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great question. So it's important to think historically about this work, and AID used to be a fully independent agency back 20 years ago or so. The structure was changed to allow for Mark Green's boss to be the Secretary of State, which provides a really strategic and important connection point. But it still is its own agency and not part of the State Department. And I think that's important for a couple reasons. I mean, one, we want to make sure that we have that voice of development sort of continuing to talk and continuing to engage. But it's also really important because it allows for a great connection point when it comes to accomplishing foreign policy objectives. The nice thing about the way that the relationship has evolved, and I think is continuing to evolve, is that there is greater coordination between the two. We see this particularly at embassies around the world where there's a lot of true integration, and we're trying to replicate that for here in Washington, looking at how each part of the Secretary's purview is working together in concert, right? This better coordination piece. The state and USAID should not be the same, right? Don't have the same comparative advantages and aren't the same organization. So understanding what each one brings to the conversation and then working them together to accomplish the big mission, that's actually a huge piece and a huge key, and actually most of what I spend my time doing.
Interesting. Let me ask you also now to turn to, you talked about the need for better coordination, not only within the U.S. government, but also with our international partners as we meet the new development challenges coming from our peer competitors and also rogue regimes. And I was wondering if you could go into the transformations you're seeing in dealing, you mentioned the Japanese, the Australians, the Europeans, in dealing with your peers in governments around the world, among our allies, and how they're reacting and adapting, and how parallel are their transformations?
No, I think that's great. So it's fascinating to talk to other actors around the world. So most other countries see two things. I mean, one, they're often closer to the challenges than we are, especially you talk about Japan or Australia. The challenges faced in Southeast Asia is particularly keen. Talk to Europeans, they're hugely focused on Africa and the Middle East because those are their backyards and they're having real impacts to the way that they sort of operate. And so they all see the challenge. They also all see the challenge and the rise of China and what that means from a development perspective. And so they're all looking at the same thing. In terms of reform, I mean, most of the development agencies are undergoing various levels of their own reforms, either building out new development financing tools, like Canada is. Canada's a couple years ahead of us, or really trying to focus on locally led development. And like the Germans are now starting to think about this, and so they're a couple years behind us. And so we're all sort of moving in the same direction, but everyone's at their own speed. But the things that I've identified are actually seen sort of more globally across all the donor community, traditional donor community outside of China.
Let me ask you on that note, and it's something which you didn't mention in your remarks, the United States has always been a leader in private development assistance, either coming from the corporate community, coming from the philanthropic community, coming also from the faith-based community, and how you see the role for private development assistance going forward in these really critical areas.
So, I think the faith-based, the NGO community, USAID and the State Department has long held really great relationships with all of those, looking at maximizing impact. The private sector has been the one that I think the United States certainly, and the rest of the world, probably a couple of years behind us, has really believed that the role of the private sector is essential when it comes to both development generally, but development in fragile states in particular. If you think about the sheer challenge that is facing the world, official development assistance, sort of regular foreign assistance from the U.S. and our partners, is never going to accomplish the mission, right? We can't create new states that have healthy economies. It's really the private sector. And so what we want to do is better partner with the private sector up and down all of our projects and all of our sectors, looking at ways to both encourage economic growth, both that impacts the United States, but also the local economic power, and look for ways to create better synergy, understand what the challenges are to economic growth in a particular country, working with the private sector and civil society to try to resolve those things. The private sector is going to be the way that the developing world becomes developed. If we believe that it's the United States taxpayers that's responsible for that, we are going to fail. We have to understand that our U.S. foreign assistance needs to be catalytic. It can't be comprehensive. And so it's catalytic, and working with the private sector is a key part of that.
Let me ask you about the data that went into, let me shift gears a little bit to the data that went into the strategic prevention project and the report here. I was wondering about what the real drivers of conflict are as you see it from a data side, and how much does the data drive the kind of development tools that you try to use in the attempt to promote this journey to self-reliance?
Yeah, so the data is hugely important because it tells you part of the story. But you should never use data to we shouldn't be robots, right? We shouldn't take data in and data out, create a solution. We have really amazing country teams all around the world that are really thinking strategically about what the data is telling us. Generally, data does help you sort of understand where a country is on its journey to self-reliance, or sort of where it is in the fragility context. Understanding how it got there and how it's going to get out of there. You need to understand the data, you need to understand some of the drivers, but you also need to understand the local context, talking to teams at embassies all around the world to help you get there. But generally, instability and conflict rises, as I said, primarily from the challenges of citizen responsive government, right? This idea that governments are not being responsive to the needs of their own people. That's what really fuels a lot of conflicts. But every country is, I always say every country is weird, because every country is weird. Every conflict is unique, and it's hard to put an overall chapeau over all of that. But generally, much of the drivers is sort of the lack of citizen responsive governments, which is why so much of the recommendations are focused in that space.
Let me ask you one more question. You talked about the Chinese model of development, the surveillance state, essentially the notion, and these are my words, not yours, that the Chinese go in and they basically tell the government, we can essentially protect you from your people. Right. We will put in this 5G system with artificial intelligence, facial recognition software. You will not have a development problem because you will be protected from your. That is a massive challenge to compete with between the payoffs to officials, which we see obviously throughout the developing world of significant sums of money, the desire to pump all this data out, send it to Beijing. The incentives the Chinese are offering are massive, and obviously there are some ways we can compete. The power of freedom is critical. Right. But the power of hard gold bullion is hard to compete with.
Yeah. No, I think when it comes to competition, one, we shouldn't compete. We shouldn't try to out-China China, right? We shouldn't try to just look for more loans, just pumping money into an unsustainable system, right? We need to be thoughtful about what are we trying to accomplish in a particular country, what's the working with civil society and sort of local actors, how can we be supportive in these countries' overall development. But it's a massive challenge, one that's going to be really fought country by country in a lot of ways. But the U.S. model really is a really attractive model, and I don't think we should ever back away from that. Rule of law, respect for law, the thriving of the private sector. This does offer a hugely attractive solution. And when countries are really being able to provide, when you're able to explain what the Chinese model of development means for them and the generations of their people, it becomes a lot more astute, right? And it's really, take there's a port that was built in Sri Lanka that was not economically sustainable, it was not a good idea, and now China owns that port. How is that good for Sri Lanka, right? So, and it's those types of conversations to help people understand and I always get my staff cringes when I say this, but China really has a neo-colonialist activities and an approach to Africa and to much of the rest of the world. Our model of journey to self-reliance is based on being good partners, not being colonialist. And I think we have to double down on the U.S. model. We have to double down on our approach and be more clear about the competing models that China and the U.S. and our fellow donors sort of offer.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Going to open it up to questions from the audience. Please keep your questions brief. Identify yourself, and if the organization you're affiliated with, let's begin back there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm Marcia Wong. I'm head of policy with the International Red Cross. But I want to congratulate Director Richardson because I was one of the original F Troop. We called it affectionately back in 2006.
There you go.
So I'm very pleased to see that F continues on and doing strategic good work. One thing, though, I wanted to ask your thoughts on were, and certainly in some of the countries that you mentioned, as I in my previous life work on sort of the strategic approach to the multi-dimensional challenges, we ran into that other tool in the national security, toolkit of sanctions. Can you comment at all on how this approach is going to work and within that construct and constraint at times?
As it relates to sanctions, I'm probably not in the best position to talk about that. I mean, I will say that again, assistance should be seen as a tool. There are lots of tools, and what our role at F is to educate policymakers about how best to use foreign assistance as a tool and partner with, in concert with other approaches, including diplomacy, including more hard power with DoD, but also with some of the financial tools. And so having that conversation about when foreign assistance can be effective and when it can't, right? Being a little bit more humble about what we can actually expect to achieve, I think will be really important. But obviously, policymakers and the way that our security system is built does have a tendency to bring in all views, including sanctions, and allows the most senior policymakers of the President and the Secretary of State to understand when to deploy each of the tools at the right time in order to accomplish the goal. And really, that's really where we see that.
Back there.
Yes, thank you. Eric Rosen. I direct an initiative called the Prevention Project. And one question I have is relates to the burden sharing aspect of your presentation, which I very much appreciated. But I didn't hear any mention of sort of the typical burden sharing sort of partners, which are multilateral organizations often. And in this space, you've seen a lot of progress out of the World Bank, a lot of progress out of UNDP, and a lot of progress out of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. I was just wondering to what extent.
Uh-oh, I cut you off.
What extent the
I know where you're going.
To what extent the current administration envisages a platform like the bank?
Yeah.
Very much going through a similar sort of rethinking about strategic prevention and conflict prevention and how to align resources there, away from poverty reduction and more towards conflict prevention as a priority, and to what extent your office and the wider State Department is looking at how to leverage the bank's increased involvement here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the bank has played a really important and positive role in this space for a while, and I'm really excited that they're continuing to double down in this space. I think working with all of our partners across both the UN system and the World Bank is incredibly valuable and incredibly important. Sometimes some of our UN partners are the only actors that we actually can turn to in some of these spaces, and so they're actually the partner of only resort. But they're really an important piece of this and one that we value. And so, but we're always looking for new ways, and I think the new leadership of the bank will certainly help facilitate greater syncing between administration policies and thinking and where the World Bank is going.
Over here. Then you're next.
Richard Jr., unaffiliated. I was just curious, I assume that the Northern Triangle countries in Central America are fragile states. I'm just curious what the U.S. foreign assistance programs are in those countries.
Yeah, so our position on Northern Triangle, we've taken a on most foreign assistance in these countries. The wouldn't necessarily be typically seen as a fragile state, although I'm sure there's some indicators that would categorize them as that. I think the challenge with Northern Triangle has been that we've had the same policy for the past 20 years toward the Northern Triangle, and the outcome is not what we are looking for. So if I go back to what I said at the very beginning, foreign assistance is a tool. It needs to be continued to evaluated with performance data about whether it's actually accomplishing the mission that it's being asked to do. When it comes to the Northern Triangle, the president made a decision that the assistance was not accomplishing the goal, so therefore we need to rethink what we're talking about and what we are doing. And as I said in another part of my presentation, I talked about country-led development. Ultimately, the Northern Triangle countries are responsible for their own development and making the hard choices that are needed. And I don't think anyone's under any illusion of what those choices are for the Northern Triangle countries. We know what they need to do in order to sort of help stem the tide of migration. And so it's a question of whether they have that true commitment to do that. So again, foreign assistance is a tool. We need to make sure that it's always doing the thing we needed to accomplish. If it's not doing that, then maybe foreign assistance isn't the right tool. In this instance, the president has decided to double down on the diplomatic approach, and then we'll use the foreign assistance once the Northern Triangle countries are to the point where they can actually help be good partners with the U.S. in accomplishing a shared vision, then assistance can be turned back on.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I confess I'm often nostalgic for the days when we saved an awful lot of money by engineering regime change. Speaking of the subject of saving money, I did a very crude back-of-the-envelope calculation on the amount of stuff we buy for AID, for ECHO, for the UN agencies, for charities, NGOs. And the number's astonishing, and most of it's going to buy the same stuff. If I assume a 10% cost savings on buying in bulk instead of each organization buying individually, the number is astounding. Tens of millions of dollars could be saved and spent on additional goods. Couldn't we step back and engineer that kind of system throughout the international aid community?
In terms of buying stuff, like
bulk.
What kind of stuff are you thinking?
Tents, spoons, every little thing that goes into refugee camps.
Got it. Yep.
ECHO buys the same stuff. We buy the same stuff. Red Cross buys the same stuff. Yeah. UN agencies buy the same stuff. It's crazy the amount of money we're losing.
When it comes to humanitarian assistance, the number of partners that we actually funnel, right? So aid and state folks aren't necessarily on the ground, building tents, right? That's not actually what we are working on. We're actually funneling money through organizations that are pulling money from other countries in order to accomplish something, right? So we see this in the World Food Program, we see this in UNHCR, and so there is sort of and actually even in like World Vision, who's also a big implementer of humanitarian assistance resources, the money is being sent to World Vision, and then they're able to maximize their outputs. But I think there is certainly a valid point there, and I think we do have an obligation to make sure we're thinking about how we are maximizing impact. So I'm happy to look into that more, but I know that because we are all using a lot of the same partners, we are getting a larger bang for the buck. The danger actually is we're paying for the same thing twice, which goes to the duplication problem, and that's where better tracking, better making sure that we are able to track every dollar to a tent or to a food kit is really important because there are some limited partners in this space. That's the danger that we run. But
Director Richardson, it's time for one more question.
Okay.
Hi, Doug Brooks, International Stability Operations Association. The contractors essentially support U.S. policies abroad. My question on the, you talked about addressing conflicts before they happen, or in DoD parlance, phase zero. And we looked at that for some time from the association perspective, from the industry perspective, what can we do in terms of phase zero? But the problem is always the money. Like newspapers, if it bleeds, it leads. And the reality is when you go to Congress and you say, hey, we can prevent a conflict by putting some money in here, you get nothing until you actually see a catastrophe on CNN or Fox or whatever. How do you bring that, how do you make that case that phase zero or addressing pre-conflict is where you want to go?
Let me ask you to turn back to your grandmother again.
Sure,
which is, is emblematic of the sort of deep skepticism about foreign aid in this country, and what are you doing to address the phase zero and the broader challenge? Phase zero first, the broader challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think two things that are essential, and they sort of underpin the vision behind F. I mean, one, we need to make sure that every dollar is aligned to policy, and two, we need to make sure that every dollar is actually accomplishing that policy that we need it to do, right? This idea of policy, resources, and performance alignment. And so we need that in order to tell a better story, right? We need to be able to say assistance isn't just something we give. It's not just $35 billion. It's here are the things that you want to accomplish. Here's how foreign assistance is built into a larger set of toolkit in order to accomplish that. And here's how we are effective at that. The State Department has not done particularly not state, but I don't think anyone in the foreign assistance world has done a particularly good job of being able to tell that narrative in a consistent and compelling way. And we do need to get better at that. I mean, it is a profound challenge sort of globally. When it comes to telling our funders this, I think it's doubly important. The Congress, and I came from Congress, love Congress, but Congress has earmarked these accounts to the dime in many ways. The flexibility is just not there in order to be able to do the things that the State Department and that our policy leaders and our ambassadors really want to accomplish. And ultimately, the question that I have is, should we become an implementing partner of Congress, or should we set the foreign policy of the United States? And we need to be able to, therefore, if we say the latter is true, we need to go into Congress with a much stronger narrative about how we are accomplishing these missions and why goals and how it is effective at doing that. It allows us to shape the funding request in a way that hopefully over time Congress can respond to. I always say that data trumps facts. I'm sorry, that data trumps feelings eventually. We don't think it's an overnight success, but we do think that having better data about the effectiveness of our assistance allows us to help tell a better story, and then allows us to then be able to make compelling arguments to Congress that we know what we're talking about, and that investing in phase zero is in fact the right answer. But it takes a lot of discipline from a lot of people, and we're committed to doing it.
Well, Director Richardson, I want to thank you. Your mission is critical, not just for American interests, but to help. You mentioned 37 countries in conflict today.
Yeah, 37.
And so the pain and suffering is immense around the world. The geo-strategic challenge posed by our peer competitors and rogue regimes is massive as well. So all of us are deeply grateful for your public service, and look forward to welcoming you back here before too long. Thank you for a fascinating presentation.
Thanks so much.
Now we're going to welcome. I think we've got to change the platform up here, but we're moving some chairs to the stage, correct? And I now have the immense pleasure of introducing my colleague and friend, Blaise Mistal, who's someone whose work I've gotten to know well over the years. He joined Hudson Institute this past year and has been doing critical work on development policy, on U.S. foreign assistance, on Turkey, and on the Middle East more broadly. He was educated at the University of Chicago and part of the large University of Chicago mafia here that I'm a part of. Did his graduate work at Yale, went on, most recently was director of the foreign policy program at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Delighted that we were able to steal him and bring him on board. And Blaise will moderate our panel and introduce the panelists. Blaise, over to you. Thank you. We need moving it.
Presto changeo. Thank you. I'd like to invite our panelists up on stage as well. And it's my privilege to welcome all of you to the Hudson Institute while we get set up here for our panel. And I'm delighted to welcome these experts here to discuss both the strategic prevention project that we just heard about from Director Richardson and some of the issues surrounding it. In particular, I'm going to spend the next 35, 40 minutes asking them about the implications of what it would mean to adopt strategic prevention as a policy for the United States, how we would actually do so, what it would look like. And then because we have so many experts in the audience, I'm going to turn it over to you guys to ask the actual hard questions. So let me start with some introductions. I'll go alphabetically, but first, in the middle, Raphael Carland is the Managing Director for Policy at the Office of U.S. Foreign Assistance Resources at the State Department, and so has had a hand in the writing of both the Strategic Prevention Project and the Stabilization Assistance Review that we heard about before that. He's worked at the Bureau of Conflict Stabilization Operations, been detailed to DoD, and served in the U.S. Army, so has some experience with all things fragile. Next to me is Jessica Trisco-Darden, an assistant professor at American University's School of International Service. She's also a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a non-resident fellow at the George Washington University's Program on Extremism. She recently wrote a terrific report for AEI on development assistance and counterterrorism, which I commend to all of you, maybe particularly in light of developments today and last night, which maybe we'll get into. At the end of the row, Rob Jenkins is Deputy Assistant Administrator of the Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance, at least for a while longer, until the reincarnation of USAID comes along. He previously served as the Director of the Office of Transition Initiatives, which is, I think, everyone's darling at USAID and the model for how we all want development assistance to work, but actually has spent time on the ground earlier in his career as well, helping design and implement relief and recovery programs in Sudan and Sierra Leone. And finally, traveling to us through a series of tubes on the screen, delighted to have Rachel Kleinfeld. She's a senior fellow for democracy, conflict, and governance at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She was the founding CEO of the Truman National Security Project, and she's the author of a terrific book, A Savage Order, the world's deadliest countries and how they can forge a path to peace. It's really a fantastic read. I commend it to all of you. So maybe I'll start with Rachel, you, and Jessica. And the first question I want to ask is really a conceptual one about this idea of strategic prevention. In some ways, to get to this question of phase zero, as we heard about in the last question, we've known that dealing with conflicts in fragile states and insurgencies and terrorism and civil wars requires more than a military approach. We've learned this for the last 20 years. We knew it before then. We learned it in Colombia. We learned it in the Balkans. We learned it in Vietnam. We learned it in the Philippines. Other powers learned it well before then. Is this really a new approach, a new concept? I mean, over the last 20 years, we've talked about stabilization, CVE, PVE, resilience is now a favorite term. We had the Freedom Agenda democratization talking about social cohesion in the past. I Googled quickly, there's at least 100 universities that offer degree programs in peace studies and conflict resolution. Is strategic prevention something new? Jessica, I'll start with you, and then Rachel will kick it over to you.
Well, my university certainly offers one of those degree programs. I think that the idea of strategic prevention that the current administration has landed on really raises the question of what is it specifically that we're trying to prevent. And I think I would like a clearer articulation of that end. And that end can be varied. It can be conflict recurrence, right? So in countries that have recently faced conflict, that have achieved some sort of stable outcome, how can we further that stability? It can also be the prevention of transnational spillover, right? Protecting neighboring countries from the conflict that surrounds them. It could be preventing new cleavages that have emerged within a country from taking on a violent form, from preventing groups from strategically and instrumentally using new and emerging cleavages to foment conflict. It can also be things like preventing mass migration that destabilize not only the country from which individuals are leaving, but also neighboring countries that are unequipped to handle such massive population flows. All of these are very different things that can lead to some element of fragility. And right now, they're essentially thrown under what is a very broad conceptual and strategic umbrella of strategic prevention. And I think that while we're moving in the right direction for individuals who really study these very different manifestations and very different triggers of violent conflict, that a better understanding of what the practical, on-the-ground policies are going to look like that fall under this broader strategic prevention umbrella is really necessary.
Thanks, Jessica. Rachel?
Sure, and please forgive me for not being in the room. I can't actually see the room, so I'm just going to do my best here. If you need to cut me off, you'll need to have somebody in the back room wave their hands wildly, and I'll see them. But I think this strategic prevention concept that the administration has hit on is really important, and it's important for both ends of that word. First, let's take the prevention part, which, as a previous speaker said, we're not so good at it in the United States. I mean, do you remember the war in Macedonia in the mid-90s, that horrific war that cost us billions and billions of dollars and so many lives in Europe? No? Well, because there wasn't one. We didn't have a war in Macedonia, and we didn't have a war in part because of preventative diplomacy that saved us massive amounts of money. But because it didn't happen, it's really hard to mobilize people around the exciting things that don't occur. So I think that's incredibly an important part of this concept. The other thing that's important here is that there's long been a fight, I think, between the left and the right in how to intervene with foreign aid, where one side, for many years, saw fragility as being about weakness, weak states that needed to strengthen. And so if the goal is to strengthen states, you put money on budget and you help the state build its military and so on. And another side, and it didn't break down perfectly along left-right, disliked aid in general and saw the best form of aid is going through religious institutions, private sector institutions, individual donations to civil society, and the United States led on helping civil society. And they really saw that the way to deliver aid and development was through the people and not through the state. And what this conception of strategic prevention shows is that you need both, because the problem of these states is not a lack of capacity, nor is it something that the people can solve on their own. The problem is that the state-society relationship is fundamentally broken. The state is trying to protect itself from its people. The people are so disempowered that they can't do anything about that. And so helping restitch that together, which requires some aid to the state, some directivity to the state through diplomacy, sometimes some DoD relationship, but also work with society itself. Both of those sides are really important. And I think that's a new concept that we're bringing together in this paper, and I think it's crucially important.
Thank you, Rachel. So, maybe, Raphael, sure. If you want to delve a little more into sort of what you see as really new here, how you distinguish strategic prevention from perhaps other approaches to fragile states, maybe touch on Jessica's question of what exactly is it meant to prevent?
Yeah. Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you for having us. I would kick off with, actually, I think Jessica asked the exactly right question, which is how we started with the Strategic Prevention Project, is this sense of we have to start thinking about this as what are our interests and objectives in these countries? And it can be all of those. It can be some of them. But before we unleash our bureaucratic machinery and the money and the people that flows from that, of which each are very legitimately tasked with specific mandates from Congress, directives from the United States or from their own governments, from international organizations, and they all start doing their thing in these places. And sometimes those are not the right things. And I think that's where the Office of Foreign Assistance has come into this process and become interested in it, because we're not the experts on how to respond to refugees, how to respond to terrorism, all these sorts of things. We have people at state and at USAID and the Defense Department and other agencies that can do this. But what we're trying to look at is how are we spending this money? To what end? How does every dollar align to our strategic interests? And I think we have to ask those questions. And I think that's what the Strategic Prevention Project is about, is how do we build this common operating picture, this common set of assumptions of what is happening in this country, what do we care about, what are we trying to stop, because it is different from country to country. There are a lot of lessons to be learned and brought from place to place, from the different experiences we've had, but each country, as my boss Jim Richardson said, including ours, is a little weird. And there are specific dynamics to those countries that we have to address. And we need to understand them before we start pouring money in. And that's where the data piece comes in and stuff. So I definitely agree with Jessica. Our hope with the Strategic Prevention Project was we would be able to answer that. And the answer is not, it is this or it is that. It is how do we bring our governments together to understand what's going on in this country and then effectuate policy in that country with this understanding. And I think that feeds directly into sort of what Rachel is saying, and something that has driven both the Strategic Prevention Project and its predecessor, the Stabilization Assistance Review, which is the nature of these conflicts, this fragility. It is an inherently political problem and a political activity in dealing with them. So we have to be careful, having worked in Afghanistan, and I know many other folks who've worked there and elsewhere, is that we sometimes approach this from a very technocratic approach. We assess what are the seeming problems, a lack of security, a lack of essential services, and we say, well, we know how to fix that. We can train police, we can help set up, provide water, provide electricity. But quickly, we come to understand, hopefully quickly, but often in some of these places after long, expensive, and painful experience, that the problem is not the provision of services or the provision of security. It's who gets to decide who gets what. Carrying a weapon in society and being able to use it on behalf of the government is a deeply political act, something that as Americans we don't really think about because it's so ingrained in our society, the rule of law, civilian control of the military. But in many of these places where there's been a lot of violence and just the basic breakdown in social structure and the contract between government and citizens that Rachel refers to, is we need to think, how do you come to those basic political agreements? And that's not, as Jim says, an inherently foreign assistance-driven task that will solve the problem. We have to have a political strategy that is reasonable to the place where it is trying to be implemented, and that is well understood back in capitals in Washington, at state and aid and our other partners, so that we can drive this along. So I would say that I really associate myself with both comments of my colleagues Jessica and Rachel, that we need to, strategic prevention is about a more holistic approach, and that it's always driven by politics, both in capitals where we work and on the ground. And the sooner we understand that, the easier it is for us to align our resources to our strategy and to our interests. Thanks.
Rob, so maybe let me turn to you last on this question. But maybe let me also ask about some of the conflict assessment tools that we have and how good they are at predicting, particularly with the wide range of possible implications that there could be of conflict and violence and the wide range of types of violence, as Rachel even writes about in her book, and sort of, do we understand the political landscape in these countries well enough to be able to say that things are moving in the wrong direction, and they might be going in this direction that is actually going to be strategically problematic for the U.S.?
Well, Blaise, thanks a lot, Blaise. And I just want to point that it's telling that we're here today is the 18th anniversary of the start of U.S. military operations in Afghanistan. And you went through a long list of lessons learned. I'd say those are lessons experienced, Those are lessons admired, but we haven't acted on those lessons. And we're talking in strategic prevention right now. The US government is part of this larger confluence and consensus that Jim alluded to, that's not just in our government, not just in this town, but if you look at what the World Bank is doing, what UNDP is doing, if you look at the Global Fragility Act that is sitting on trying to work its way through the Hill, if you look at USIP's recent report on preventing violent extremism in fragile states, if you look at the SAR, if you guys have not read the Stabilization Assistance Review, it's only 15 pages, there's lots of pictures, and it is a compendium of things we always knew. But after 18 years of banging our heads against the wall, we've put those things in there, and they hold up not just for stabilization, but also if you want to look at how are we supposed to prevent things, how do we do peacemaking. It's not about money, it's not about more people and more boots on the ground. We can't want it more than the people themselves. Those lessons are all there, we all knew them, but now we're focusing on it. If you look at what USAID is doing with Administrator Mark Green's leadership and what Jim Richardson did before he was stolen by State Department, we are doing the largest reorganization in our history at one time. We call it transformation. Part of that is tearing apart my current bureau, which is the democracy, conflict, humanitarian assistance, over a quarter of the entire budget of USAID, put together in trying to do too many things at one time, and for the first time creating a bureau that is purely for conflict, prevention, and stabilization, focusing on that. And you can't start things differently in this town, especially with just a snap of a finger. It will take time. But there is more focus at State Department and USAID now on what we've always known, which is an ounce of prevention is better than a whole lot of cure. But we've never been able to, as Doug, as you mentioned, we all know prevention is a good thing, but we can't get any money for it. Well, we're going to make another stab at this. For years, we've been talking about the relief to development continuum, and then it became the nexus. And now people have actually realized it's not just relief and development. Where's the peace part of that, the peace part of that? We're going to try to do that now, moving forward. What are we trying to prevent? You can put it any different way you want. A lot of those things are all symptoms of the same problem. States that have conflict. So it's whether you see conflict coming at you, in conflict, or coming out of it, as already been alluded to, it's very simple. If people do not have agency in their lives, if people do not have a relationship with the state that they see as beneficial to them, you're going to have a weak place. And you can't fix it in a year, and you can't fix it in 2. We found out we haven't fixed it in 18 in Afghanistan. A lot of these are generational problems. But when you ask, do we have the tools to predict what is the right thing in the right place? Raphael, you and Jim said that every country's weird. I like the Tolstoy analogy, right? All happy countries are the same, and all unhappy countries are unhappy in their own way. That's part of the lesson that's in the SAR. Everything is hyper-contextual. Every country, every province of that country, every district in that province has its own weaknesses, has its own strengths that we need to look at. So you need to look at these things for what they are. You need a talented team of people, not just the US government, but bring in other donors, get the burden sharing, analyze the problem, leave your ego at the door, and work on competitive advantage, not competition, work together, and then have the strategic patience to keep it going. I just want to end with, I'm very happy, Rachel, that you brought up the Ohrid Agreement in Macedonia, because people often overlook that. The Ohrid Agreement, many people don't even know what it was. It was another Balkans war that was prevented because of diplomacy and fast, agile foreign assistance working hand in hand with that diplomacy that prevented the war that we don't know about because it never happened.
Thanks, Rob. So maybe let me re-ask Jessica's question a little bit and get to this question of, it's one thing for us to learn lessons that we've already learned or crystallize them or institutionalize them in the way we're now designing the way USAID works or the way that state works. But that still leaves the question of when should we use this tool? Even if we're building this tool, when should we use it? You know, as Director Richardson said, there's 37 countries in conflict now. Fragility seems to unfortunately be spreading. Is strategic prevention something that's designed to work in any country that seems to be fragile, in any country that seems to be on the brink of conflict? Are there specific strategic reasons that we should be engaging in countries? Thinking about this specifically in the context of the current national security strategy, which reorients us to great power competition, to geopolitical threats from countries like China, Russia. How does this fit into that strategic framework? Raphael, maybe start with you.
Sure. I think the first thing that I would say is how you think about how we're trying to think about strategic prevention. It's not a fire extinguisher, an axe under glass that some alarm goes off, we break it, and we go into action. It's a framework and a way of looking at countries and conflicts and regions. And it's about understanding all of the tools that are available, not just foreign assistance, and what are the objectives we're trying to go at. And for instance, in the Office of Foreign Assistance, obviously we do a lot of foreign assistance, but we also own the strategy office for the State Department that works very closely with counterparts at USAID to develop the joint strategic plan for the State Department, and that cascades down to these integrated country strategies, which are built by the country team and signed off by the ambassador. This is the ambassador's 4-year plan. And what we want to do is mainstream conflict prevention, strategic prevention into the development of these plans. And the plans aren't carved in stone. They can be changed as new ambassadors arrive, as new policy comes into play. But that this becomes a normal piece of the way we think about problems. I mean, Jim mentioned 50% of our assistance, we're talking $15–20 billion a year, is spent in these fragile places. And a lot of it's on really good programs that we are trying to do in education and health and in governance and economic growth. But are they tailored and attuned to some of the problems that are going on in that country? I mean, the example we all use, a great response collaboration between USAID and OTI and the State Department is Kenya through its elections. There are huge international investments helping in health and in agriculture, food for peace, but a tiny amount spent on conflict prevention and on elections. And I think it was how are we looking at all of our assistance to drive towards a conflict prevention outcome so that there's not a mass outbreak of violence surrounding an election, which happened once but has not happened in the 2 elections since. And I wouldn't put that all at the feet of the U.S. government. It's really about the Kenyan people and their political processes. But are the tools that we have available to support those outcomes, are they tiered and tailored towards that? I think that's the important piece. And then I think as we look more broadly, this is supposed to capture, I think, a lot of those, the programs and pieces that we're looking at. So again, not something we want to break glass and bring out. It's something we want to feed into the system so that everyone is thinking about prevention in many of these places. Because we invest a lot of money in these countries and sometimes, but not focus on the violence, the strife, the conflict at hand, and the investments that both we make and the international community, and most importantly, the citizens of that country can be undermined by a violent election, a breakdown, or some sort of actual civil violence. And that's what we're trying to do.
Thanks. Rachel, can I kick it over to you to talk a little bit about sort of the interplay of the national security strategy and prevention?
Sure. I can also answer the last question.
Yeah.
So I think that one of the ways that we confuse our actions in this particular area of strategic prevention is to think it's only about what we do and not about what we don't do. Like the previous speaker, I think one of the lenses that this gives us is to say, are our programs in education and health and the other things we're giving money to in these countries, are they actually making the problem worse? We know from 2011, almost a decade ago, from the World Bank, that conflict is what sends countries down to the bottom. It's like a snakes and ladders, down to the very bottom of the development scale. And so if we do nothing else, preventing conflict is probably the first thing we should do. And as this study showed, it's often the last thing we do if we do it at all. But we can take that lens and look at it in terms of all of our other programs. Just to give 2 quick examples. In Afghanistan, we were running some programs in a particularly terrorist-ridden portion of the country near Kandahar. And to run those programs, we were paying a security service. Now, the security service happens to be linked to a major warlord in the area. And we actually didn't seem to know that, but everyone in the area knew that. And so they assumed that what we were trying to do was strengthen that particular warlord, because how did we not know that that's who we were paying for security for our projects that had nothing to do with this? That's the kind of failure to see that we're trying to prevent. Contrast that with in Indonesia, they had a school program to just get textbooks to schools, or sorry, in the Philippines, to get textbooks to schools on far-flung islands. And rather than just give the textbooks to schools, they paid citizens to monitor the delivery of the textbooks to schools. That does a whole lot of things. It empowers citizens. It gets the textbooks to the schools, ensures that they're there. It gets the citizens interested in the educational system and in the delivery of goods from the state. That's what we're talking about in terms of rebuilding the state-society relationship. And it's taking this lens on aid and applying it to everything we're doing in these conflict and fragile countries. That can mean doing less. And to get back to your original question, do we do this in all the countries that are fragile and conflict affected? I don't think so, but I think the choice of where we do it really matters. I would say, because this requires such a deep understanding of countries, fewer is better. It's much better to pick a few that we think we can make a difference in and do it well than to do try to do this in 37 countries. What we can do in 37 countries is not do harm. We can look at the programs we're doing, as in a place like Afghanistan, and change them so that we're not doing harm. But the active programming, we probably need to pick a few winners. How we pick them, though, is a political decision. We can choose based on the countries where we think it's most important to get it right. Countries where we're facing great power competition, countries where we think war is imminent. Those are also probably the harder countries generally to do it in. So, high level of impact, low level of success likelihood. And admitting that ahead of time and figuring out what your metrics are going to be ahead of time to admit that. Or you can pick countries where the level of impact is much more likely, but the possibility of it mattering is low. And so, there's the low-hanging fruit, but it's also less strategic countries, and you can pick metrics based on that. That's a decision ultimately that should be up to the NSC working in tandem with state and USAID. And hopefully they're thinking about that strategic confluence and particularly about how to make the metrics fit which side they're picking. Because what I'd hate to see is for this whole idea to get thrown out because we're picking the hardest countries that matter the most, where it is going to take generations and it might not even work then, but the trying is really worth it. And judging them as if they're the low-hanging fruit, that would be the worst outcome.
Rob, so in the transformation of USAID, has any thinking been given to this question of criteria for selecting countries for prevention, for these sorts of conflict-afflicted, conflict-sensitive programming, and how we choose and where we choose to apply that lens?
So I'd say a lot of thinking has gone into it. I do not have a great big reveal of the 7 countries that we're going to start with. As usual, I agree wholeheartedly with both Raphael and Rachel that on one, it's a way of looking at what we do in these countries across the board. It's a concept of operations. It's a different way of analyzing the problem. It is, yes, phase 0 is a business that we're not usually, that's not a term that we usually use. We call it development. It's realigning what we do as development professionals to, I like to say that I work for a national security agency that just happens to have development in its name. It's putting these ideas front and center when we're designing, when we're analyzing, designing the programs, and then implementing them. However, I agree that if we're really going to do this right, we need to pick a few to start with that we're going to focus on. That is hard. So when I got the first drafts and I'm reading the report that we're here to talk about today, going through my head was, how am I going to get all of USAID to agree on 3 to 5 countries to start with? And then once I get USAID to agree, how is Raphael, and I see Peter laughing in the back, how are we going to get state to agree on 3 to 5 countries? And then how are we going to get DO? That's hard. there's a lot of momentum that's building right now around these things. Some have said we need a new USAID strategy on what is prevention to answer your questions. I'm anti-intellectual. I go, I want to do something. It will take us 2 years to come up with a strategy on prevention. Let's just make sure we do no harm and we try to prevent bad things from happening. That's good enough for me. It's not good enough for a lot of people. But without that definition of what we're trying to prevent, and there's a definition in there, which is I'm good to go. That's good enough for me. If we can get with the interagency an architecture by which we will prioritize, it won't be perfect. The metrics will be a little bit messy. They'll still be debated. That's fine. It is a political decision. But if we as a government can say, we are going to do this different thing in these countries for the following reasons, and here's 5, let us know in 18 to 24 months how we're doing against our metrics. Let's see how it works. Otherwise, this could be another one of those 4 years from now, there's going to be some other group of people sitting up here and talking about a new term that we're using, as alluded to before, and we're all going to say, didn't we try this about 15 times? This is the time it's going to work. I'm sure of it, but we only have a limited amount of time to show that there's a difference. And I think to do that, we need to marshal across the interagency, outside the interagency, other donors. I was meeting with a group of donors on Saturday on Yemen. We're going to see a bunch of them in London next week. We're meeting with a whole bunch of different people tomorrow of different embassies around town. We are trying to get forces aligned to move out sharply and to do this differently. We know how to do it, we just haven't done it. If we can focus on 5 places, 3 places, give us 18 months, I'm sure we can make a difference. I just don't want us to get bogged down in that process, but it needs to happen.
Thanks, Rob. I want to come back to, well, first of all, kudos on the can-do attitude. I want to come back to the institutional question and the interagency question, but maybe, Jessica, I'm going to turn around your question to you, and what would you prevent, or maybe even, if we don't want to go that, what do you think in light of and in alignment with our national security strategy that the Trump administration has released, what should we be preventing? And I mean, there's reports that the White House is doing a review of foreign assistance, and according to some reports, doesn't want to be in the business of addressing the socioeconomic causes of terrorism, is questioning whether we should be engaged in fragile states. Is there strategic value to this sort of engagement still in your mind?
So I had the pleasure of spending a lot of time this summer in the Balkans, in Kosovo, and Albania, and Montenegro, and in Bosnia. And as Bosnia is one of the focus countries that was examined as part of the Strategic Prevention Project. And what I saw in Bosnia actually fits very closely with what's being described in the national security strategy. Not only a situation where we have attempts for Russian influence operations in Republika Srpska, but where we also have strong disinformation campaigns being propagated. And we're not only competing with adversaries such as Russia in that space, or Iran, we're also competing with sometimes allies like Turkey or the UAE. And so we do see this kind of intense pressure on some fragile states from the outside, which is very much what I think the administration's national security strategy is attempting to isolate. At the same time, we've tried to do quite a bit of prevention work in a country like Bosnia and Herzegovina. We've trained journalists, we've trained lawyers, we've trained civil society activists, we've done election monitoring, we've done all of this work, and yet when you speak to people on the ground, they're pessimistic. Their young people are leaving their country, right? There's no sense that there is an economic or political future there, in part because there's no political will for the real change that we want to see and that we hope to bring about. That even if you have wonderfully trained journalists who are getting out there and getting at the facts and getting to the truth, their editors, the owners of their publications won't publish that work. Right? So we do need to identify countries where there's sufficient political will, not only at a national but a subnational level, to bring about some of the change that we're hoping to see through a strategic prevention perspective. But we also need to be very clear about where U.S. national interests currently are situated. And I think that this administration has articulated a very clear message that the United States is not going to be the world's policeman, that we're not going to be intervening in every district, in every province, in every country where there's a potential or emerging conflict. And so I luckily am not tasked with the difficult process that my government colleagues are tasked with, but I do think that that really is integral, and I share the kind of impetus that we need to act on this, because too often we have these grand new ideas, they're introduced, and I'm sensitive to the fact that there are real risks in strategic prevention. The very things that make these states fragile put our operations there at risk of failure. But if we can acknowledge that and be very upfront that these are environments where there is oftentimes political corruption, oftentimes a risk of fraud or diversion of foreign assistance resources, and accept that risk and still move forward, then I do think that this will have the potential to change individuals' lives.
Raphael, Rob, do you want to comment on the foreign assistance review?
Sure. We haven't seen the final version of it. I'm told earlier versions talked about what aid particularly did in the countering violent extremism space. And the programming that was looking at the drivers of violent extremism, and as you mentioned, socio-economic drivers, that those programs have not shown great success. At aid, we've said, you're exactly right. We were looking at the problem from the wrong direction. At the time, we all thought that jobs programs were the best thing to do because obviously if you are an angry young man and you get a job, then you won't become a violent extremist. Well, that's not actually true. Education programs, we can educate our way out of this because if you educate all these people, they will not be angry. Well, on 9/11, all of those people that flew those airplanes had jobs and they all were highly educated. That's not the problem. So over time, the term CVE also had money attached to it. So as any bureaucracy does, people started coming up with all kinds of great programs that were also CVE programs. That way they can get those programs funded. We've come up with an entirely different way of looking at CVE within USAID. In fact, today or tomorrow, our new CVE strategy is supposed to be posted for external comment on the USAID website. We're saying now, if the program is not specifically targeted at countering violent extremists, if that's not the objective, it's not a CVE program. And if you are focused on those objectives, you need to be monitoring and evaluating against that objective. Not that we had a lot of trainings and everyone liked the training and look how much money that we've spent. That doesn't work. We're also looking at a systems approach. It's not about us trying to solve this with US foreign assistance and little programs. It's what do we do to help that country to build their political will, because you're totally bang on that. They need to want this to not be a problem for them. So how do we help? Kenya is also a great example of this, where we have worked with the Kenyan government at the national level, helped to protect. They have now created their own national counterterrorism center. We've worked with them. They now, on the provincial and the district level, each district in Kenya now has its own national it has a CVE plan that is specific to that district. The government gets it. They're working with us. We're not trying to buy our way out of the problem. We're trying to help countries. We're doing great programs in Indonesia right now, working at both the national, the local, and in between levels. What does that country need to do to deal with their own violent extremism program? We're doing it in the Balkans. Are we going to solve it? No. I think that's one of the things that we're also have learned, that countering violent extremism is not about eliminating the threat of violent extremism. It is part of human nature. We've dealt with it for centuries. You cannot get rid of all the violent extremism in the world. You need to mitigate it. You need to squelch it. You need to calm it down, and you need to make sure the homeland is secure. But this is a generational problem. It's not a 5-year problem, a 3-year problem. It's giving countries what they need to help them work with their people so that people have agency in their own development and a new social contract that they see that there's an off-ramp from being an extremist, and there's a future that says maybe tomorrow will be better than today. That's what we're focused on, and it's not the same old social economic driver programs that we used to do.
Those concerns about past and effective approaches, not necessarily the objectives of countering extremism or even working in fragile states.
Yeah, I think if I can jump in, I think it's just CVE definitely caught some of the interest, but I think a broader theme is approaching is this idea that we came to very naturally again in our society is that poverty drives violence. It drives all sorts of illnesses. If you can alleviate poverty, violence will recede. And maybe in a generic sense that is true, but the timeline and the dollars that the U.S. government has available to support that's not the solution. It circles back to what we were trying to do through the Stabilization Assistance Review, the SPP, and frankly all diplomacy and development. It's an inherently political endeavor. When you are giving other people money to do things, it's political. And that is where we really have to get at it. That solving economic issues and poverty is a long-term issue in these countries. What we can help, and we can't solve those. Their own private sector, the broader private sector has to. But what we can help is with the political dynamics, is helping them come to a political, not necessarily a solution, but a process by which they make decisions amongst themselves in a manner, a participatory manner that works for their country that is not violent. And that's where we're really trying to get at. And I think when you looked at some of these concerns, and they're not just in this review, one needs only to hear public remarks from the president and the secretary to understand their concern at these open-ended commitments where we're doing things for countries and spending lives and treasure and blood to do things that I think the locals should feel compelled to, and if they don't, then why are we spending money on those issues? And so it's about directing funding towards the political solution and not towards these age-old. I mean, you look at some of the wealthiest countries in the world, they have poverty. So ending poverty is not something that can be done easily. But there are a lot of these countries with strong rule of law, there's not a lot of violence. And it's about a political process by which decisions can be made non-violently.
So I want to ask maybe one or two more questions, then turn it over to the audience. But institutionally, one thing that was interesting to me was that the SAR, the Stabilization Assistance Review, was put out by your two agencies and DoD jointly. The Strategic Prevention Report is a product of the State Department, F specifically. Sort of why the distinction there on the interagency process? What is the role of the big gorilla that's not on the stage of the Defense Department in thinking about prevention? And more broadly, maybe you sort of alluded to this, Rob, and Rachel's point really clarified this for me, is if it's as much about what we're not going to do as what we're going to do, then it's not really about running an additional program in a country, right? We're not talking about business as usual in Mali, but add on a prevention module, right? It's really about overhauling our entire approach to that country, and that really requires sign-off by policymakers across the interagency spectrum, and all of them being on board and sharing those objectives. Sort of how you see the process for getting that in place in order to be, have this can-do attitude, Rob.
If I can jump in first, it's a very specific reason the Strategic Prevention Project is a state-run piece. It was very interagency in its work. It was modeled off the SAR, but actually state aid and DoD action officers ended up doing a ton of research and work on the SAR and realizing what a success it was. We were able to come across a small pot of money to support our research, and the State Department, we were the executor of it, and we were able to hire an amazing firm that is present here, Frontier Design, that was able to do a lot of this work and to free up our policy people to think about policy. But I would say in actual process, we've had regular meetings. DoD has been very present. They obviously, security sector assistance is a huge piece of strategic prevention and of stabilization. And in fact, it's one of the real things we need to drive at. And I hope to hear from Rachel a little bit on this, because I think she's really thinking innovatively about this and how we go about doing some of those things. But the whole process has been very interagency. We'll continue to work with DoD and, of course, our USAID colleagues. So that's just a technical answer, but I'll let you offer a more eloquent
No, I
description.
offer a can-do attitude. We've been together the whole way through this. And while we need to define what we're talking about so we can come up with solutions, I think we also can over-define these things. So we have stabilization, and then we have prevention, we have resilience, there's a whole bunch of other, we have peace-building initiatives. You know, that Venn diagram gets really complicated, but it has a hell of a lot more overlap. I mean, you know, I would not be the first person to ask, is this stabilization program prevention or is it post-conflict? Well, I've never seen a post-conflict program that's not trying to prevent more conflict. So we try to put things in too many boxes, and then we put a different team on each box, and then before you know it, you have a new office for each thing, and you're like, but aren't we all just trying to save, you name the country? So part of this is to, yes, know what we're talking about prevention, and yes, have a definition for stabilization, but then just pull back and put multidisciplinary, multi-agency teams on a problem set and say, forget defining this and putting it into a bureaucratic box. What is the problem that needs to be solved? What can the U.S. government bring to that problem set? Who has the right skills? I don't care what your office is or what department you're from. Who has the right people? Who has some money this month? Who can find the right contractor? Nice shout out. I don't know if she paid for that.
Well deserved.
And get on with it. The paralysis of analysis and the loss of momentum that happens all the time in this town when we're trying to help people overseas who know exactly what the problem is, we just don't listen to them. There's a talented embassy and USAID mission and usually a DoD team on the ground that could tell you in 15 minutes exactly what they want to do. We go, no, we got to have a big process back here. And then 6 months later, everything sort of just dwindled away. So we need to start knowing that these are long-term, sometimes generational solutions. We still need to move at the speed of relevance, something this government and my agency in particular is not always good at doing. We need to often put small amounts of money on small targets, something that this government and our agency is not always good at doing. And we also then need to be able to adjust what we're doing, take those risks, which is hard, take risks, and then know we're going to make some mistakes. We're going to fail sometimes. Fail fast, learn from it, pivot, move out again, and do it. The more we pull back, the more we start over-defining, the more we start saying we're going to have another thing for resilience and another thing for sustainability, and then what is the linkage to the, we'll be back here again in 2 years coming up with a new term. So we have the prevention, which is awesome. We have the SAR. I think the time for writing is done. We have enough. There's enough data to keep us all busy. Let's just then get it going, get on with it, and make it happen, and show a difference.
So, Rachel, move fast and break things. Is that is that an effective approach to working the U.S. bureaucracy, or sort of what are some of the institutional design issues that you think are brought up by trying to put in place strategic prevention?
So when I started my career, actually, I was looking at rule of law programs overseas 20-some years ago, Europe versus the United States. And one of the things that I noted was that Europe was much smarter, just across the board, really well thought through. They'd planned it all out. They had all these great structures. And America was not. Our thinking was pretty rudimentary at that point in the early 90s about how to do this stuff. But then when you got on the ground, they couldn't implement to save their lives, and we were just doing things on the fly and making it work. So I have a lot of sympathy for where Rob's coming from. I actually think that there's a lot to be said for just getting on the ground and doing it. I do think there are some things that are pretty fundamental that need to change. And that does not require, I think, a ton more analysis. I agree that we have a lot of analysis, and I agree that Frontier Strategy Group did an amazing job with the analysis here. It's really there, and it's really good. I know the Brits, who I work with very closely, are trying to learn from our process because they're trying to do the same thing. They have to put 50% of their money for aid into conflict-affected countries, and now they're trying to move that aid into preventing the conflict in those conflict-affected countries, and they're trying to learn from our process. So this is going to leverage a lot more, but it's also going to leverage countries that like to write and think and analyze even more than our own. So what are the couple of things that we do need to change? One thing I think is to recognize that, as a previous speaker said, poverty does not cause violence. There is just no evidence that poor people or poor countries are more violent than other places. What we do know is that bad governments cause violence, and a lot of bad governments happen to lodge in countries that are also poor. There's a confluence, but not a causality. And what do we know about causality? We know that things like terrorism are highly driven by state violence. We know that refugee flows are highly driven by state violence. So, for instance, there's a great UN study of about 500 violent extremists across northern Africa and the Middle East. 71% of the cases, the person turns from being angry to being violent because of an incident of state violence. So what does that tell us? It tells us that our security sector reform work is really important to this, and that we're not doing it particularly well. Our list of failures in our security sector reform is vast, and our list of successes is pretty poor. So that's an area where I think we do need some more study, some more thought, some better metrics, and so on. Some of that is already trying to move through Congress. There's a state re-off bill that's got some really good things in it. Some of that's being changed at the DSCA within the DOD, but there's more work that needs to be done there. What are some other areas that need more work? I think thinking through how you prevent violent extremism within countries in terms of a bigger picture. I know that we're moving away from poverty equals violent extremism, but to say, let's not pay for meetings, I think then becomes sort of counterproductive. And let me just give an example of what I mean here. Stephen Hadley and I wrote a paper for USIP a couple of years ago on Colombia and Plan Colombia and the peace process in Colombia, and what had taken an almost failed state, a very close to failed state, into being a functional middle-income country again. And if you look at that trajectory, some people say it was our DOD investment, the amount of money that we poured into their military sector. Actually, the study doesn't bear that out. We put a lot of money in much earlier, and it kept failing over and over and over again. What Stephen and I came to was that when society was ready to use that money well, that's when Plan Colombia worked. Society and the state had to be working in tandem to say, hey, we're pointed at the same direction. To get society and the state there took foreigners sponsoring a lot of just meetings. They didn't seem to go anywhere. They weren't particularly sexy. They didn't cost much money. But outside intervention happened to be really good at two different things. Really good at bringing together two dichotomized sides of a argument that did not want to be in the room together. In Colombia's case, it was the left and right. In the case of Tajikistan and their peace agreement, it was a variety of different warring tribes. But outsiders can play a role saying, hey, we bring money, we bring a new perspective, we bring prestige, come to our meeting, you don't have to like each other, just show up. And that process actually seems to really matter in violent, weak states, to getting state and society more aligned. And we do that very well as outsiders. Another thing we do very well as outsiders is that we can use diplomacy. We can use some carrot and stick. To take Colombia again, September 10th, 2001, the day before September 11th, we did something really important, which was that we put Colombia's paramilitary groups on our State Department terrorist watch list. If you don't think that that had a lot to do with them coming to the table and making an agreement to disarm, you're not paying attention to the trajectory of that change. Putting them on that terrorist watch list played a huge role in them realizing that the gig was up and that they were going to get a better deal if they made peace right then than if they waited any longer. So by using our diplomacy with one hand, we as outsiders can then incentivize the change more locally. So I think there's a lot that we bring to the table that we can do. There's a lot that we bring to the table that we still need to study to figure out how to do better. And then there are some things, as Rob says, that we can just get working on right now. We don't need to study, we need to iterate.
Thanks, Rachel. Jessica, some thoughts on this?
I just wanted to add to Rachel's excellent point that, you know, there has been a lot of focus on the failure of security sector reform and security sector stabilization initiatives, and much of that criticism is due. But I have a book that's coming out next month on this question of the relationship between U.S. foreign assistance and state violence specifically. And having looked at 40 years of foreign assistance to 132 countries and done very rigorous statistical analyses, I find that it's actually not this type of military assistance that's driving a lot of the state violence that we're seeing in the developing world. And that, in fact, the economic assistance actually has a much larger role to play than has previously been acknowledged. And it's specific forms of economic assistance that are also driving this. So things like food aid that are highly fungible, that can be captured and distributed to political supporters, are really influencing a lot of the state violence that we're seeing, not only in the past in places like Colombia, but also on the ground today in places like Yemen and Somalia and Syria. And so we really need to understand, as I think page 14 of the report that we're discussing today really points out, is that the distribution of foreign assistance resources is an inherently political decision, not only on our end, but in recipient countries as well, and that whatever aid we provide, whether it's economic or military or humanitarian, that foreign assistance will have very real political consequences. And what we're trying to do by focusing on strategic prevention is leverage those political consequences for our benefit, but also for the benefit of individuals in those countries by mitigating and reducing risk of conflict.
Thank you all. With that, let me open it up to the audience for questions. Please remember to identify yourself, keep it brief, and actually ask a question in the middle there, please. Yeah, microphone's coming.
Hi, Mihir Desai, CEO of Dexus Consulting Group. We work both with USAID and State Department on stabilization and security sector reform. We worked in about 100 countries in the last 3 years for our clients, so that's more places than most people lose their luggage, I would say. I love what Jessica mentioned. Inherently, it is a foreign assistance programming resources is a political thing. I love what Rob said, that the challenges on the ground are generational. They are. So I was here just last Friday on a Kashmir topic that was raised here. And as I was here, the phone goes up and says, oh, report come out by 2 guys who coined nuclear winter. And they said the impact from the conflict in India and Pakistan over Kashmir could hit 100 million, could kill 100 million people if it has to happen. And yeah, it is a generational problem. This is the time where the generational issue has hit sort of a peak. Anyway, I'm not sure if that region is even in the vocabulary of the strategic prevention list. And if we're talking about 3 or 5 countries that are going to make it to the top of the table and everything else hits the cutting room floor, why can't we just simply acknowledge that this thing is inherently, the process is inherently political, selection is inherently flawed, inherently illogical, and just like move on with it?
As I said, it's going to be very difficult for the interagency within our government to come around a few places, because there's, sales are ahead of production in this business. There's way too many places that are at risk. I think as Rachel said, one of the things you'd want to look at is odds on success versus what happens if 2 nuclear powers go to war with each other. It's going to be an intense debate on trying to identify some places if we can. If it didn't make enough sense the first time, I just want that debate to be short, and then once we all agree, we agree and move out and get some focus, because there's plenty of places that we can put on that list. We just need to start somewhere and then see how it goes.
Yeah, I would say part of the risk, and I'm not saying that's what anyone is currently doing, but the risk that exists is that we look at a case like that and we say, oh, well, actually, they did go to war, right? We had the Kargil War. It wasn't that bad. It got contained, and we extrapolate from that. And so the question is, when we're making these sorts of decisions, what is the balance between kind of backward-looking historical analysis and forward-looking predictive models? And my concern as someone who works with quantitative and qualitative data is that those 2 things are inherently related, right? Our predictive models can only be built on past experiences. And so when we're looking at kind of dramatically different or dramatically evolving situations, who is inputting the data, the critical intelligence, the critical knowledge that we need to shift our existing models? And I think that the State Department and USAID have both been making a lot of progress in those areas, focusing more on data analytics and, of course, the systems model that Rob referred to, but that we really need to be wary of kind of what inputs are leading to what outputs in these decisions.
I'd just say 2 things along that line. Is strategic prevention project is a lot about how we use foreign assistance to achieve strategic prevention and support strategic prevention. But to quote my own boss, which we should all do very often, foreign assistance is just a tool. It's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing, it's about how, when, and where we use it and where it's appropriate. And I think we need to have, and we are having, not at my level, not what I'm working on, but strategic conversations about what gets New Delhi and Islamabad's attention and other regional powers to think about an outcome, preventing an outcome that could kill 100 million plus people. And I think that is taking place. I'm not sure those two countries' foreign assistance is what grabs their attention, so maybe it's the wrong tool. I know some other folks in the audience had mentioned other tools, and that's what it's about. The other thing, though, I would say, and this is one of the points where Rob and I slightly disagree, is I definitely sympathize with his frustration over process, time-consuming process in Washington. But I do think some of these questions, before we rush in, and to quote, he likes to say, fools rush in, before we jump into conflict countries, I think there is deeper conversations and strategy sessions that need to happen in Washington that are not about process. And process actually impedes figuring out who needs to be at the table, how big should the table be, what rank people should, who gets to clear out, look at a document first, who gets to look at it last, all those sorts of silly things. We do need to cut back on those. But what we're talking about with the strategic prevention process is this opportunity to have the right people at the table, however big the table may be, and to ensure that a lot of different views are being brought to bear. Because I think as our system is currently focused, for good or for ill, it's very regional country expert specific. But there's a lot of skill sets, from managing refugees to managing conflict to rule of law, that there are lessons to be learned across countries and across regions, that if you are the expert on Yemen, of course you have a lead role in what's going on in Yemen, but you may not understand how things have happened in Libya or Lebanon or Colombia for that matter, what we can do to bring those lessons identified, experienced to the fore. So I think that's really important, because we always have to be careful about jumping in too fast. I know, coming from when I was in the military, we are often quoted that Teddy Roosevelt quote, when in a crisis, make a decision. Even a bad decision is better than no decision. And maybe as a young platoon leader, that is true in the military. But I think all of us, where we are in Washington, have to realize that strategy made quickly is generally made poorly, and that we have more time to think about this. We just have to clear the decks and allow the right people to have the right amount of time to think about something before we start executing. So that's the balance I would say. I think there is some value in understanding what we're trying to do. Is foreign assistance, and therefore strategic prevention, the right thing in the Kashmir conflict? I personally don't know, but maybe it's not, maybe it is. But I think certainly in places like Yemen or Libya, foreign assistance matched with diplomacy matters a great deal. And so what you call it, how you think about it, to an extent matters, as long as it doesn't take 2 years to farm it all out. So that would be my only point. Thanks.
All right, we're running short on time, so maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions together and then do a lightning round. Yes, sir, over here as well.
I'll try to make this very brief. I think it's important to ask the panel what your reaction is to the situations in the Western Hemisphere, both the Organization of American States, the association of so many countries in Europe, as well as throughout the Western Hemisphere, coming together with respect to response to the situation in Venezuela. The dissipation of the Monroe Doctrine over the last 10 or 15, 20 years, isn't it important, number one, to focus on our neighbors? And number two, does the new president of Mexico's proposal or his concept have any benefit or participation in what you're planning?
Thank you, sir. And one more across the row.
Hi, Steve Schwartz, retired Foreign Service officer. 2 quick things. One, Jessica, when you described Bosnia, I wasn't sure at the end whether you were suggesting it's a place that we should invest or not, because there wasn't that senior engagement. But more broadly for all of you, to what extent is this a Washington process? And to what extent are the country teams in the field bought in, and will they drive the design and the end, the implementation, and are there resources for that in terms of democracy and governance officers, political officers, and money, and how quickly can that happen? Thanks.
Thank you. So Rachel, maybe we'll start with you. You want to chime in on any of those?
Sure. Let me take the Venezuela question. I think the question there is that it's not only what we want to do, it's what we can do in Venezuela and how we do it. I would say that it gets pretty far afield from this particular issue of strategic prevention, given our aid profile in Venezuela right now. But I would say that what you have in Venezuela is a narco state where the military is a cartel and has no reason to step down. What possible thing can we give them to give them a reason to step down? Well, what they probably want is to keep their money. They want some kind of safe passage, and they'll need some sort of threat that what they have right now is under threat, or else they won't do that. That's what's backing the regime there. So trying to get an uprising of the people or what have you in Venezuela, it just doesn't make sense till you deal with the military. We know that from regime change in general, that the security services are the linchpin. And right now the security services are running an organized criminal drug cartel. So what does that mean for Mexico? What it means is that I do not believe it's helpful for Mexico to be on the side that they're on. However, it can be helpful to this particular situation. So I don't think it's helpful it doesn't agree with my ideology, put it that way. However, you need mediators to get a group like the military of Venezuela to have an exit plan. And mediators have to be trusted. And so if Mexico is becoming a trusted mediator, that can be useful. When I was younger, I come from a very conservative family. I happen to be pretty liberal, but both sides of that thinking were very black and white. It was very much, is this good, is this bad from a moral perspective? And while I came down on different sides of that from my family, it was the same kind of thinking. And as I've grown into geopolitics and foreign policy, I've realized you don't turn a country like the countries we're working with in the strategic prevention framework, they don't become Denmark. To rate them on whether they've become Denmark in the 10 or 15 years that we work on them, it doesn't even make sense. What we're dealing with is incremental change, places getting better. Colombia is not a safe and secure country. It's a lot better than it was in the early 90s, in the early 2000s even. The same thing with Bosnia. It's a powder keg, but it's not killing people. They don't have genocide right now. That's a win. What you're looking for in these societies is how do you work with reality to get them a little bit better over time? And what I love about the strategic prevention framework is that I think it says, how do we take the money we're already putting into these countries? How do we take the resources that we're already contributing and re-steer them, reorient them so that we do a better job? And I think that's worth a lot.
Jessica, Bosnia or other topics?
Bosnia or bust. I would say I'm agnostic on the Bosnia question, right? So one perspective is you broke it, you bought it, that a lot of the problems that are on the ground right now are a result of Dayton and the structure, the political structure that imposed. I'd be happy to discuss that more with you. But I also think that there's a strong argument to be made that, we don't want to let a country that is in Europe that has such strong ties to essentially become some sort of Turkish or Saudi or Gulf vassal state, and that we actually have really strong strategic interests in ensuring that that doesn't happen.
Rob, on
Steve, thanks for the question. We don't have much time. I'll answer for aid. You can say for state. I would say, frankly, right now it's very much a Washington-driven process, informed a lot by the field. This will fail if it stays a Washington-driven process. Lots of other great, amazing Washington ideas have failed before, and we always say it's going to be field-driven, and then it's not. So as I look at this, it's about trying to put, from AID's perspective, the mission director who finds herself with conflict coming, or she finds herself in conflict or coming out of conflict, how do we give her the tools that she needs to analyze the program, to design the new programs, and then implement those new programs? And we've talked to a lot of AID colleagues, including a group of mission directors that I have as a sort of a steering committee right now on the design of the new bureau. It's always, they need money, They need mechanisms and they need people. If you give them that and let them be in the driver's seat, and we always go, oh, you'll be in the driver's seat, and then we tell them everything they're supposed to do and all the different things they can't do, and then we get something that looks exactly like it's always looked, that is the challenge for success, is if we can actually let Washington ideas then be transformed into their ideas and processes and be in support of them. It's much easier to say than do, but that's one of the biggest challenges we're looking at to make this thing work. Washington-driven or not?
I think it starts in Washington and has to start in Washington. I think the Stabilization Assistance Review is a good example of how it progresses. We've now moved beyond this sort of Washington interagency discussion to, we've pushed out to a number of our key embassies that Jim Richardson mentioned, of having them, based on a template, because we can't have 1,000 different plans and none of that, because then in the position we are in F, but also in USAID headquarters, of having to go to the White House and having to go to Congress and the American people ultimately and say $1 here gets you $2 here, and that a decision had to be made to go with this option versus that option. And so there has to be some sort of comparable data. There has to be some sort of template by which all these plans that we are looking through kind of look the same, so we sort of understand what they're asking for and whether or not we can provide it. So we're at 2 years into the SAR. We have countries, they've sent back stabilization plans to a rough template. So they're starting to think about the problems in the same way. And so the resource responses contextualized to the country is what we're looking for. And that is what we're looking for in the strategic prevention space. It'll be bigger because to one degree or another, almost every place of the 70+ countries that we do give foreign assistance to, the reason we are giving them foreign assistance, by and large, is that they need help. And that help usually for all the technical, this, that, and the other, it comes back to what we were saying. There is a political dynamic in that country where they're struggling to make peaceful decisions that represent what their country wants versus all of these countervailing international forces, be they non-governmental or malign actors. And that's what we're trying to do. So I think it has to start in Washington, and we create templates and general strategic guidance. But here is the challenge that Rob lays out, is to put down the proverbial 10,000 mile long screwdriver and let these super talented people, of which we would flatter ourselves by saying at one point or another, we were these people, that these folks, they can execute, that they can come up with the operational plans, the action plans, saying, these are the resources, this is the guidance. But most importantly, they can come back and say, this is the world, this is the reasonable world of what I can achieve in these spaces. And that's something that Washington and the field really have to get better at, talking honestly to one another of, this is what I can do with the resources you've given me. And if we have to say, well, that's good enough for where we're prioritizing back here in Washington. So I think there'll be that balance, but as you know, probably from working in Washington and the field, I'm not sure we'll ever get it perfectly, but I think this is a good start.
So let me say that I hope you are all back here in 2 years or less, not with a new buzzword, not to complain about process knife fights, but to tell us about how you've executed and what you've achieved. So let us thank our panelists, even those who are not here in the room with us, for their expertise and for joining us. And thanks to all of you for coming out today.
Thank you. Well done. You can disagree with me always.